Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by our guest, Dr. Terrence Wandtke, to talk about Robert Kirkman and The Walking Dead. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back.
Happy to be here.
You have a book that you've edited, which is a collection of interviews with Robert Kirkman, and you are a storehouse of knowledge about the show and his career. So I'm glad that you're here again so we can explore all of that.
Yeah.
I'm considering you as sort of a zombie expert too, if you don't mind that title. And I wanted to start off by talking about the history of zombies and where this comes from, that there's no literary precedent for this, right? They didn't come out of Greek mythology or anything like that, right?
That's right. There's not a very long history behind zombies.
Yeah.
And the reason that is so fascinating to me is that it seems to be our monster of choice right now. It's not like we've given up on other monsters. We have plenty of vampires and werewolves and creatures that look like they've been created by a Frankenstein type out there.
Right.
But really,
if there was a battle for the world, the zombies would win because they outnumber everyone else.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But also, when we take a look at the numbers as they're represented in television shows and movies, we have this overwhelming representation when it comes to zombies and zombie culture. If we look back throughout time, many of the monsters that we know come out of folklore. And yes, there are Walking Dead in folklore, but they look nothing like the zombie that we know in films now. We can trace maybe back to White Zombie, the movie with Bela Lugosi, but even that is nothing like the zombie that we look at.
The Bela Lugosi movie, that was about voodoo, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So the original zombies were voodoo zombies, right? And they weren't eating people; they were just kind of walking around, kind of mindlessly and obeying whoever was controlling their soul, right?
That's the main thing, is that we have a voodoo master who basically takes someone through this process, basically turns them from someone who's living into someone who's dead and enslaves them.
Yeah.
And really it's, the way that it worked its way into our experience in Hollywood, it really was depicted as a fear of the foreign other,
you think?
In terms, well, as far as those films went, particularly White Zombie.
There were, I lived in New Orleans one summer, 1969, I think. And, there was this woman, Kumi, who was walking around talking to the hippies about white light and black light and stuff. And I remember having conversations with people there about voodoo, and people believed that voodoo was something that was going on.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just a literary motif in a movie.
No, it wasn't just a literary motif. I think one of the most famous popular books about it is The Serpent and the Rainbow, which takes a look at the culture of voodoo and the way that we understand it through both the mythology that's created within that context, but also some of the science that might be behind the basic ideas there. Yeah. So it exists in those basic forms, but like I said, that only bears a passing resemblance to the zombies we know.
Yeah.
We see
there's at least there's a potential for an explanation for that. I mean, somebody could be psychologically, entangled in some or spiritually entangled in something. But the zombies of today, are really hard to explain. It's really hard to come up with an explanation for why a corpse can, especially the new ones, because they're running around now. Right. But anyway, sorry to interrupt. Let's go back to the beginning.
But I mean, one of the things that you were bringing up is that there's some clear parallels, right? We can imagine how those stories could be started.
Right.
But in the grand scheme of things, if we're thinking about monsters always work that way, that there always seems to be some sort of parallel. And I think the best monsters work that way. Yeah. Monsters always are ideally what we hope we're not, but really fear we are.
Right.
So it comes out of that lived experience. So when it comes to the zombies that we know, there's a few precedents that we could point to that are slightly literary. We could go to the comic books of the 1950s, lots of reanimated corpses there, but those tended to be corpses that came back because they represented the repressed that someone tried to bury. A wife killed a husband and the husband came back to her.
Well, that has intense psychological nuances to it, I think, because how many things do we all have in our past that we've walked away from and forgotten about that would surprise us and stop us in our tracks if they came back, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. But there are characters or creatures in earlier movies and in stories that at least looked and acted like zombies, like the Frankenstein character, for instance.
Right.
Right.
Well, and that's an interesting comparison or contrast, as it may be, and also, one of the things that ultimately will influence Kirkman is that in part it was definitely a horror story for him.
Yeah.
But it's something else for him too. It's this survival story. It is like a disaster movie.
Yeah.
Basically, how a group of people can learn to survive this terrible thing that is happening around them. That is the interesting psychology of the zombie movie, is that it's a story of survivors as much as it is the monsters. So it's not so much the monsters and how we fight them. It's more the people around us and how we get along to survive with them.
And he's made a number of changes in the zombie tradition, right?
Right.
His stories in The Walking Dead, more character-based, more dialogue-driven.
Absolutely.
Right? So for him, I know he's really into the zombie motif, right? But I mean, to some extent, isn't this also just a vehicle for him to develop drama about other things, about human nature?
It definitely is. So if we're dealing with Robert Kirkman and the Walking Dead, we're of course jumping forward. So The Walking Dead as a comic would debut in 2003, and for him, I think he was. And he would admit this openly, he was inspired by the Romero movies. Lots of things happened in between. The zombies moved through a natural evolution.
Most people were frightened by the Romero movies, but we're talking about somebody who's inspired by the Romero movies, right? That's a good defining moment there, yeah.
In terms of the zombies as they did evolve in film, they went through the same sort of evolution that we see other monsters going through. So if we go back to the heyday of the Universal monster movies, it didn't take long before we were no longer very scared of them, and we had movies like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Right.
Similar things happened with the zombie, in that we moved into a different movie that he was not associated with, called Return to the Living Dead, where they started to have spoofy elements in there.
Yeah.
And when he came back to it, there was some hesitation, in part because there was a question about whether or not people would be interested in zombies in the early 2000s, and whether or not his particular approach would be compelling, because he, like I think a lot of other great horror writers in my mind, really deal with the characters. It is the depth of characters that causes us to fully feel the horror or terror of what is going on, because we care about these characters and we're afraid of them in the face of monsters, and we certainly don't want to see them die.
And that was what Marvel Comics changed to begin with, and Kirkman came up through Marvel Comics, didn't he?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So his start was as a comics fan. He worked in a comic book shop. This was in the 1990s, and it was a good time in some ways for him to get a foot in the field, because there were many opportunities presented that hadn't been there before. So the comic book shop offered opportunities for independent publishers. That's what he did to get in the field in the first place. He came up with an outrageous concept. He came up with a comic called Battle Pope.
The Battle Pope.
Yeah, which is about a papal figure who was chosen by God to have big muscles and big guns to fight against the demon hordes. It was silly and meant to be so, but it was something that got him on the stands and was allowed him to get distributed. He published it himself. It ran him into deep debt.
And he published this with credit card debt and things like that,
right? Right, he put it all on his credit card.
What's it cost to get started? Did you have any information on that? I mean, what did he spend?
What did he spend? Tens of thousands of dollars.
Really?
Yeah, because he openly admitted he would get one credit card after another, just fill out the next application so he could keep going.
So when he got started, he wasn't just selling these at the local supermarket. He distributed them.
Right, so Diamond Distributors was the primary distributor sending comics to comic book shops across the United States.
Yeah.
In order to be distributed by them, you had to have something that they bought into, and that's he sent several things their way. Battle Pope was what they bought into. So it was being distributed far and wide enough that he got a reputation, and eventually was able to get his foot in a few other places. writing for properties. He did a He-Man and Masters of the Universe spinoff. He wrote some minor titles for Image, and then worked his way over to Marvel. So he worked his way into Marvel Comics and wrote some of the major superheroes.
Yeah.
over there.
So what does that look like? I mean, he goes into Marvel Comics one day with a portfolio, and they look at his stuff and they say, "Yeah, you can write a Spider-Man for us."
Well, the amazing thing about Robert Kirkman is that he's an ordinary guy. At least that's the way he presents himself. But
Does he come off as an ordinary guy?
He comes off as an ordinary guy. He really does in terms of his presentation. He's funny. He seems to be very down to earth. And in that way, I relate him very much to Stan Lee. Because Stan Lee had a very similar persona.
Yeah.
But both of them are terribly self-promoting, and they're ingratiating. They're able to work their way into situations by becoming fast friends with the people that they talk to. His first two series that ended up being long-running series were Invincible, which was a sort of revisionist superhero series, and then The Walking Dead, and that was his big seller.
Yeah.
The funny thing is when it came to The Walking Dead and he pitched it in the first place, they didn't think it would work, and they also said that we want something that's more original.
Well, so how did his art, his philosophy, his approach change when he got to TV? I'm sure you're tracking some differences there, right?
It did change, but I think it expanded some of what we saw already. In terms of what he did with comic books, he was always very collaborative. So he would seek out artists who he felt he could inspire, maybe artists who weren't well known yet, but artists he knew fit his series very well. And that's an interesting thing in of itself, because you look at the artists he chooses and they're very different. So it creates a very different identity for the series.
Yet there's a genre there that they're all aware of.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, his superhero comic looks much more iconic in terms of its representation. Walking Dead is incredibly realistic, with Charlie Adlard, a great partner for him there. But he was always very reactive in the sense that he would look at the way things were drawn, and he always said, I write differently. In fact, I'm probably more excited about the comics when they come to me than most people are when they hit the stands. So he would write the scripts, they'd come back to him, and he'd be thrilled by what he saw. But it ultimately ended up being a collaboration. I think that was so important as he moved into other media forms. Because of course, if you think about our modern media age, whether you're thinking about film or television or video games, you see that long list of credits at the end.
Probably no art form in history more collaborative than making movies.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So as he moved into that, part of what he had to do was collaborate and realize that his story, the Walking Dead story, was his, but also not his. Yeah. One other thing that I would say along those lines that led him in that direction is that he was a former fan. And so he kind of understood that dynamic already, in the sense that fans feel a certain amount of ownership over the characters that they read. They're not their creations, but they feel like they are. So he was willing in a lot of ways, when it came to The Walking Dead, to collaborate. His first collaborator on it was Frank Darabont. Frank Darabont is famous as the guy who actually made some good Stephen King movies. Stephen King movies were notorious for not being very good for a long time. Yeah. Frank Darabont did The Shawshank Redemption. He did The Green Mile, both of which are very character-driven. And so I think he got what The Walking Dead was about.
Kubrick did one that wasn't too bad, too.
We'll give him The Shining, okay.
Yeah.
But I think he understood the character-driven nature of it. They worked together, they collaborated, they came up with a pitch, and again, had a hard time selling it. They first tried to sell it to a major network, NBC, a little too on the edge for them.
Right.
Then they tried to sell it to HBO. HBO, probably not too far off the beaten path in terms of content, but I don't think that they quite understood what the show was about. And they certainly didn't understand the continuing story of a zombie apocalypse. Yeah. That is one of the huge innovations that Kirkman is bringing to it. It's not just a 2-hour movie. We can put up with an apocalypse for 2 hours, But the appeal of a zombie apocalypse over the course of 10 seasons, most people didn't understand that.
But it was brilliant, you know, and
it was.
the execs that turned him down are holding tin cups right now on
They
Hollywood
absolutely
Boulevard,
are,
right?
Yeah. So AMC was the network that picked it up. And that's interesting in and of itself because AMC is sort of an old school cable channel. AMC standing for American Movie Classics, but they changed their approach.
They were making a move when they did that, yeah.
They became the network that then did Breaking Bad and Mad Men and then The Walking Dead, and so this was a major catch for them. And then as far as Kirkman's philosophy, we had a team of writers that were working on it. And of course, other people who were in charge of other things had to collaborate with actors and cinematographers and so forth. And he
fell into that
that
okay, didn't he?
He did. He loved the collaboration because one of the things that you can tell is if you go from the comic book series to the television series is that there are so many variations.
Yeah.
And he has talked about this pretty extensively because there are characters that are near and dear to him. The main protagonist.
Who are his favorite characters?
Well, undoubtedly is the character that he started with. So in terms of the series, the comic book series, we start with Rick Grimes. And the interesting thing about the revival of zombies is that the movie 28 Days Later and The Walking Dead came out at exactly the same time.
Oh.
And they have the same premise, is that someone has been unconscious in a hospital and they wake up to the zombie apocalypse that has been taking place around them. Yeah. Rick wakes up to this. He seems in some ways like a perfect character to handle the unexpected. He's a sheriff's deputy. He's the guy who has access to guns. He has a quest because he's in search of his wife and child.
Yeah.
But Kirkman is the master of subversion. So he takes that character and he puts him through the ringer in a lot of ways. And I think that's part of what brings him closer to a lot of characters is to see them go through those trials. And as a consequence, know that character more fully. It's fine to set him up as almost a cowboy type hero, but the thing that Kirkman's really interested in are things that cause someone like Rick Grimes to make bad decisions as well as good decisions.
Yeah. He when he started that out, I wasn't sure if Rick was the main character or not. Do you it's been a long time since I saw that, but did he do that on purpose? Was he trying to sneak up on us a little bit there?
Very much. If you look at some of the things that he said early on, even in relationship to the comic book series, people pegged Rick as the main character. Zombie stories are always ensemble stories, right? Again, it's the survivor group. How do we get along with people we wouldn't normally have chosen to be with? And one of the things he kept saying over and over again, initially I thought it was just a scheme, but I think he genuinely meant it at the beginning. He kept saying, Rick could die. 6 issues from now, he could die. I think he genuinely meant it because he had, even from that point, this notion that I have to be improvisational. One of the things that he said is that I try not to plot too far ahead because I want deaths to be shocking. That's the way they are in real life. And so I don't want to necessarily prepare myself for that because if I do, I will write myself into a triumphant end for this character instead of a sudden shocking end for this character.
And you're a professor of literature at East West University, and so I'm sure you're aware there are a lot of writers who have said that they don't know how their books are going to end, right?
Absolutely.
They create the characters and they're playing it out and they have to follow where it's taking them, right?
And put these characters together and as a consequence, that shapes the story.
Yeah. Well, now, did the actors influence this at all? I mean, does he have conversations with them and do they say, I really think my character should do this? Because some of my favorite movies were more actor-driven, I think, than director-driven in some cases.
In terms of the ways in which the series, the television series, departs from the comic book series, some of the things that are most surprising for readers and then watchers of the television series are the ways in which the characters continue to live or suddenly die because they're the characters who don't have that same arc.
Yeah.
So an excellent example of that, and of course, spoilers ahead for this. In the comic book series, the character Carol dies fairly early on in the series, but she's become one of the central characters. She's an incredibly compelling character, and one of the things that caused them to write her and continue to write her, to keep her alive, was the performance of the actress who was behind it. She is fantastic. And one of the things that I mentioned is that I think that undoubtedly Rick is one of Robert Kirkman's favorite characters. And again, spoilers ahead.
Rick's going to come back, right?
The thing about the comic book is Rick is a consistent presence all the way through the end, and it becomes very much a story about the relationship between him and his son, and so we have Rick actually dying shortly before the end of the comic book series, and then we jump forward many years later. We see a full-grown Carl, and we see what happens to him. In the series, Carl is dead now. He died about halfway through. We
after
had
losing
Rick,
his eye.
Right, after losing his eye. And we have Rick, who continued on for some time, but then was wounded and disappeared from the series. So the character who really, in most people's minds, was the central character, and I think in Kirkman's mind was the central character, is gone from the series. So they've had to adjust, and so characters like Daryl, who has no comic book correspondent, has become central. Carol has become correspondent.
Now, the fact that Daryl's still there surprises me because, this is a dialogue-heavy zombie movie by comparison to everything else, right? And he's the most quiet person on the set, right?
He is. He's incredibly quiet and soft-spoken. So yeah, it's interesting to think of it in those terms because Kirkman is an incredibly dialogue-heavy writer. Going back to the comic books again, I think it must have been so incredibly difficult for Charlie Adlard to write some of these because Kirkman doesn't like flashbacks. He doesn't like dream sequences. So if he has characters telling about their past, we have two characters who are talking to each other, panel after panel. In the series, it's the same. So yes, we have moments that are punctuated by zombie attacks. We have big moments like that because those are the genre expectations. But Kirkman has said plot is just an excuse for me to get to character. And so when it comes to these characters, the thing that actually makes Daryl compelling is again the actor. He says a lot with his face. There was recently a series of episodes at the end of the 10th season. So we're in the 10th season. 11th season is supposed to be the last one for The Walking Dead. But they did some COVID episodes. So they knew there was going to be a gap between the 10th and the 11th season. So they did some COVID episodes. And they were smaller episodes. And I would just assume that Kirkman loved these episodes because they were character-driven. And we had one that revolved around Daryl. And the interesting thing was that part of it was in conversation with Carol, and then we did actually get some flashbacks in the series. We see this more often in the television series than we do the comic book. And so much of that was punctuated by the quiet time that he was spending with this other character who he had never met before. And so he would jump forward months at a time. It was almost like you'd imagine Daryl being quiet all that time, and then the next thing that he said.
Well, so who makes it to the end?
Well, it's hard to say at this point because we have some people, like I said, who are alive that were no longer alive in the comic.
Daryl and Carol have survived.
Daryl and Carol are there.
Carol wasn't in the very beginning, or was she? Was she in the first?
She was in the first season.
She was in that group that was stranded on the side of the road?
Right. She was in that caravan that was created. We have Ezekiel, who's still alive, who's dead in the comic, but he does seem to have some sort of cancerous growth, so who knows if he's going to make it to the end. There's a lot of speculation about who might show up again in the end. So Michonne has been a fan favorite character, but she's left in search of Rick.
So there are a group of characters that disappeared, but weren't necessarily killed by zombies.
They weren't necessarily killed by zombies.
So they're still in the quiver. They
could bring them back,
redrawn,
and they have brought some back. One of the dynamics, of course, is that sometimes it is story driven. But we had some characters who just became popular and decided to try their luck as actors elsewhere, so left and then came back after that.
And Rick's coming back for a movie?
Rick is coming back in some way. So The Walking Dead has definitely become a franchise at AMC. So we've got spin-off series.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of spin-off series. We have Fear the Walking Dead, which is going into its 6th season, I believe. So that's been around for a while as well. And we've got a new series, and yes, a feature film. The intention originally was to make a feature film with Rick and to release it at the theaters. I don't know if that's still the plan, because theatrical releases are not what they were.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Terrence Wandtke for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.